So good evening, I'm Emma West. I'm a partner at Bousfields, and I'm also the Vice Chair and Chair of Mission Advancement for ULI Toronto. On behalf of our Management Committee and our Advisory Board, we'd like to welcome you to our event this evening. It's our first Electric Cities debate, and we're very pleased to have you all here. Many of you may be familiar with the Urban Land Institute, or ULI, but many of you may not be. So before we get started, I'm just going to do a brief introduction and let you know who we are. The Urban Land Institute, or ULI Toronto, is one of 73 district or national councils that exist in the Urban Land Institute, or ULI, around the world. And our mission is to advance the responsible use of land in the pursuit of fostering healthy communities. So we seek to ensure that land is used most optimally, and that where possible, we're achieving multiple benefits with the use of that land. So taking into account the environment, the economy, quality of life, mobility, affordability in every sense of the word, and social equity, to name just a few of the things that we think about at ULI. We further our mission by tapping into our diverse membership. So here at ULI Toronto, we have 1,500 members, which makes us one of the largest district councils around the world in terms of the number of members that we have. And we've recently hit that mark after a few really great years of growth within ULI Toronto. Our membership is made up of people working in the private sector, the public sector, and not-for-profit. And that's really important to who we are, because we want to have good discussions and, as you will see tonight, bring many different points of view to the table. An important thing to note about the Urban Land Institute is that our mission is based on advancing this idea of the responsible use of land through education and not advocacy. So through quality dialogue and through the exploration of issues and things like tonight's debate, we seek to improve public policy outcomes that are related to the use of land and contribute to better city and region building. So tonight is a great example, as I said, of how ULI Toronto seeks to contribute to important land use decisions in the region by examining major issues. So tonight we'll be looking at how the shape and form of how we choose to develop our region as one of North America's fastest growing areas is balanced against the challenge of affordability. And as one of the most aggressive real estate markets in North America, only after Vancouver, that's an important consideration. So to keep things moving along and not take too much time up here, I'd like to introduce our chair of the Urban Land Institute Toronto, Derek Goring, who will introduce the debate participants and our panelists, and will serve as tonight's moderator. So welcome, Derek.
Thanks, Emma. Good evening, everyone. As Emma mentioned, I'm the chair of ULI Toronto, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you here tonight for this debate. For some context, as most of you know, the provincial government is in the midst of updating some really important provincial policy that dictates how the region is meant to grow in relation to major infrastructure such as public transit. These plans, including the Greenbelt and the Regional Growth Plan, represent North America's strongest public policy around the use of land and in achieving urban intensification and regional transit-oriented development. But 10 years after the original enactment of these plans, some are questioning whether they've had some unintended consequences, and in particular, the erosion of housing affordability in the region. And that's what we're here to talk about tonight. But in true ULI fashion, it's not just about conversation, it's about solutions. So that's something that we hope to talk about tonight as well. To this end, we have invited Professor David Amborski from the Ryerson University School of Urban and Regional Planning and Professor Marcus Mose of University of Waterloo School of Planning to be the lead presenters representing two different perspectives on this topic. Following Professors Amborski and Mose, we will invite two distinguished panelists, Pamela Blay from Metropole Consulting and Russell Matthews from Hemson Consulting, to offer brief responses and the opportunity to add some additional points to the conversation. Just for everyone's information and to make things move along, we've posted everyone's bios to the website, so feel free to check those out. Once the presentations are over, I will moderate a debate, including some hopefully really active audience participation. And you're also welcome to submit questions via email to toronto@uli.org, as well as through Twitter using the hashtag #ElectricCities, all one word. So we're really interested in and happy to have this debate, and let's get started. So first off, I'd like to welcome Professor Amborski to lead things off.
Thank you, Derek. It's a pleasure to be here this evening and participate in this discussion, because I think collectively we'll come up with some ideas and approaches to how to address the issue. First of all, I want to make it clear that first and foremost, I'm an urban planner, so I do believe in the growth plan as being a necessary tool. I do believe in the Greenbelt as being a useful planning tool as well. But I'm also an economist. So I believe firmly in looking at the economic impacts of land use and land use tools. And that's something that's very important, I think, to understand. Both the direct economic impacts and the indirect economic impacts are both important. This is also the approach we take in our center, the Center for Urban Research and Land Development. There we try and look at the economic aspects of urban issues and try to shed light on things from an economic perspective. Not that it's the only perspective, but I think it's been underplayed, and it needs to be up there with environmental, social, and other concerns that we have as planners. So the approach I'll take tonight is trying to have some economic input into the understanding for the reasons and causes of the high and escalating prices, especially for owner-occupied, ground-associated units, because that's where the greatest increase is. That's where I think some of the issues are. The premise, of course, is that the growth plan is a form of growth control. It's come under many terms. It could be called growth management. It could be called urban containment policy. And we also have the Greenbelt. And these are plans that need to be looked at and considered in that light. If we look at these, we want to look at the economic impacts and how that affects particularly housing affordability. So I'm going to stray a little bit towards the economic side, do a little bit on the kind of some basics of economics. I want to talk about some of the early studies in the U.S. related to containment policies, and also look at some of the data on supply issues here in this area. And then lastly, make a comment about some other considerations that we haven't really talked about, but longer run considerations from regulation and affordability that are being considered in the U.S. and we may need to think about in the longer run here. I think these things are a bit important as well. First, just point very basic economics. I'm not going to give a lecture in economics, but all I want to do is point out that when looking at the housing market, you have to look at both the supply and demand. Neither independently determines the price. Alfred Marshall, the neoclassic economist, said it best, if you have a pair of scissors cutting a piece of paper, which one's doing the cutting? In the same fashion, supply and demand work together to determine prices. So we have to understand both. That was done in the Federal Provincial Land Price Study, the Greenspan report, as you recall. They started looking at monopoly and ended up looking at demand, so you have to look at both issues together. They're both important. One of the things, though, you have to understand is when you're looking at the housing market, you have to look at what the primary inputs are on the supply side. Of course, the demand side is also important. Obviously, it looks at people's incomes, number of households, tastes and preferences, and a whole affordability issue. The supply side, of course, looks at the factor inputs, land, labor, and capital, with land being the primary component. So I'm going to move quickly to talk a little about the land side and just set one basic premise. When you do put constraints in place, like the Greenbelt, you're going to constrain the total land supply. Now, that in itself isn't a problem in the short run, but just to illustrate that, there would be moving the supply curve to the left. It shows an increase in prices. And I think we have enough land available, so in the short run, it's not going to be an impact. It may be in the very long run in the broad market. But you have to also recognize there are submarkets. If there's some municipality that has a lot of employment and a large percentage of land goes in the Greenbelt, it could have impacts on supply in that small submarket. So there's that aspect I have to keep in mind as well. The other aspect about demand and supply, and I'm not going to go into the details of the way the market operates, but economists look at something called the stock adjustment model. They look at the fact in the short run that if demand increases, prices go up, and then you look at the flow coming in, it's going to trigger a supply response where more housing comes on stream. So if you're looking at the supply response to increased demand, the important thing then is to see what are the factors and costs on the supply side. And this is where the land becomes important because the land is the major factor input into the price of housing. It's a very important component. It's not produced, it's fixed in supply, and it's something that has to be considered. Now, when we're talking about supply of land, I gave that graph before and I made the comment that we're looking at the total supply of land. That's not the operative supply we look at. We're looking at a flow of new housing coming on stream. In addition to looking at the total supply, you can look at the supply of land that's designated for urban use. The Nexus report looked at that, or the NEPTIS report looked at that. And then you have to drill down even further. You have to look at the supply of land that's serviced and approved. It's the supply of land that's serviced and approved is the land that can come on stream quickly. Designated land might take 5 or 7 years. It can't respond quickly. So the relevant supply is that is serviced and approved. So that's something we have to keep in mind. When we talk about regulations and containment policies, and we talk about smart growth, there's some literature in the US that points out some of the impacts that we have seen. And again, I'm normally in kind of an academic approach, I'd show the material and kind of talk about it. Here I'm just trying to point out some of the studies and who have done them to try to show some of the things that have been determined in US markets. A couple of studies here have looked at the impact of growth management containment policies, one by Anthony Downs, very prominent economist at the Brookings Institution, and he concluded after a series of papers with a number of colleagues that containment policies do have an impact of forcing prices upward, unless you take very active approaches to try and address the affordability issue. Also, Chris Nelson did some piece for the American Planning Association looking at urban containment. And again, he says you have to look at supply carefully, and if without doing that, you're going to have issues of increase in the price of housing and affordability issues. So the literature in the US has looked at these things, often empirically, has found that these kinds of policies do have a tendency to have that happen. That should be a warning for us that we have to look at this and consider this and be aware of some of the issues that might arise. There's also a more empirical study done by Lincoln Institute where they looked at all the US smart growth policies on a statewide basis. And they had general findings, again, based on the regression analysis, firm quantitative analysis, that the present smart growth policies had an impact on rental and ownership affordability. It had upward bias on affordability. So we have evidence from the states. We don't have the evidence here, but there's not a strong reason why we wouldn't be concerned about that to see if we have similar kinds of issues. So containment seems to push things upward a bit. And we do have some evidence of rapid price increase, and I'm not saying it's all from the supply side, but there is a nice piece that was presented at a ULI seminar last week by Econ Northwest when they were looking at inclusionary zoning, and they compared Toronto to US cities in terms of the housing market appreciation over a 12-month period. And I found it kind of intriguing as to the people in the room that those two that had the highest rate of appreciation were both cities that have urban containment policies. There was Toronto and it was Portland. So it was kind of an interesting, it's not conclusive, but it just shows a trend. It's something you might want to think about. If we look at other kinds of data and information, we can look at increases in the average sale price of new and resale ground-related housing in the GTA. We can see that those prices are increasing very significantly, both in terms of resale and in new. We can see that they're much faster increasing than the Consumer Price Index, and we've seen dramatic increases. If we look at MLS, ground-related increase in prices, and compare it to housing starts for ground-related units, we can see that ground-related units housing starts have been tailing off. Why is that happening? If there's a high price, why are they not being built? What's the problem? Could it be that there's a problem getting supply on stream? And that could be possible. So here we have some evidence, again, that gives us some indication of what might be going on. Another kind of indicator of what's going on in the market would be lot prices. If lot prices are going up, it probably reflects a shortage of supply of those. And this graph shows lot prices, new home prices in the GTA, 2005 to 2016, and it shows again that particularly since 2010, we've seen a dramatic increase in lot prices. So we've seen those rising as well. One of the major input, of course, into ground-associated units. So we have some data, some trends. We see some things happening. There's also a study that was being done for the Canadian home builders, in which they're making a submission to the federal government for the National Housing Strategy, and they talk about supply issues. And in there, they quote some data from Altus that says that in March of 2016, if you look at the number of ground-related units for sale in 905, there were 3,036. If you look at the number of ground-related units for sale 10 years ago, in 2006 March, it was 16,757. So we see a tremendous drop-off in the units that are available for sale in the market as well. The other kind of interesting fact that occurred, I was at the Let's Talk Housing National Housing Strategy Expert Roundtables last week, and there are a number of different roundtable groups. One of the roundtables was looking at affordability in high-price markets, specifically looking at Toronto and Vancouver. And we reported out at the end of the day, I wasn't in that group, I was in another group, and the report from that group, the first comment, the first point, was there is complete consensus in the group on supply being a major problem, part of the problem. And here we had experts from all across Canada. This was reported out by Sir Somerville, who's at the UBC Business School in real estate. So again, there's recognition that this is an issue that needs to be addressed in some way. Now, related to that, it's not the first time we've heard that there needs to be addressed the supply side issue. The U.S. provides some cautions on this. If you look at the work of Garrett Knapp, who's the executive director of the National Center for Smart Growth, as far back as 2003 and 2005, he's been looking at smart growth in Portland and other major cities in the U.S. He said you have to look at and monitor both housing and land supply and take corrective measures if you don't have affordability problems. So he's looked at this over time, he's made suggestions how to do it, and it's something that's been very important. And the point is, we really haven't done this. We haven't looked at these economic impacts. We do have some regulations in place. If you look at policy 1.4.1 of the provincial policy statement, it does require municipalities to keep a 3-year supply of service lots and report this on an annual basis. So we do have some mechanisms in our legislative structure to try to address this issue for that supply, again, being the serviced, approved lots, the ones that can come on stream quickly. We did some research at the Center for Urban Research and Land Development. We tried to do a survey of what the various jurisdictions were doing in 905. And when we did this research, we found that none of the 905 regional governments were monitoring or keeping a 3-year supply. And on the local level, we already found Whitby and Oshawa taking this on. So again, here's something we could do positively to try and address that supply issue that's not being done. Now, taking this one other step further, beyond just the supply issue from that perspective, the other literature that has emerged to a great extent is the impact of regulation, land use regulation on affordability and on house prices. And here we're not talking necessarily about only constraints, we're talking about other land use regulations. And again, I'm not saying we shouldn't have them, but we should recognize that they do have impacts. In the US, they've been looking at this quite seriously. If you read The Economist had some articles about this. You would see that in the U.S., there's work by Edward Glaser from Harvard University at Penn, it's a Penn study. The Council of Economic Advisors, in their report to the President, pointed out that regulations have an impact on housing affordability. There's work in the UK by Paul Cheshire. There's a whole raft of literature on this topic. And it's not to say we shouldn't have regulation, but we should be careful when we try and over-regulate. We have one of the strongest regulatory structures in North America, and now, as might be called Growth Plan 2.0, again, it's almost doubling down on some of the regulations. So before we enter into that, we should look at the economic impacts. What's it going to do? And take consideration of what should put in place, or if it's having impacts, what we do to mitigate them. So that's something that's very important. What's happened also in the U.S. is the urban economists have begun to look at even further impacts of increased prices and lack of affordability in housing markets. One aspect, and I'm not saying all these things happen here, but I'm saying there's things you need to think about and consider in the longer run because it could become a problem. One of the issues has been the impact on the GDP in local markets. We're basically the engine of the economy for Canada. And if we were going to have our GDP reduced, we should think about how we address that, if regulation can affect that. And this is a report, from Richard Florida when he was speaking in a City Lab, and he's reporting basically on some work by two economists, Enrique and Hanesh, and they looked at 220 metropolitan areas, and they looked at the impact of regulation having a negative impact on GDP in these cities. Again, 1.6 trillion, it's like mind-blowing. And it's like that's what Richard Florida wrote it as kind of big piece to try and get people's attention. And if you read their paper, they don't really try and do the sensationalism. He did it for kind of in the paper. The other issue that's come to front, I'm not going to comment on here, I'm going to end here, is that there are a couple other economists who have looked at the impacts on disparity, that affordability issues have led to greater disparity in many large cities between income levels, high income and low income. So again, I'm not saying that's an issue, but if you watch Holchansky's Three Torontos, you got to wonder if that's having an impact on the growing disparity in his monitoring of Three Torontos. So we have to think about these things, and if not undertake necessarily less regulation, but at least understand the impacts to try and take policies in place to try and mitigate them. So I'll end here and look forward to the discussion and questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David, and now I'll welcome Marcus to the stage.
Thank you to the Urban Land Institute for organizing this. Thank you to all the panelists for being here. And of course, thanks to the audience for making it out this evening. It seems like we're going to start on common ground because I will start by saying housing affordability is a huge problem in Canada and then in the big cities and in the GTA in particular. Is the Greenbelt to blame? That's the question, right? On the one hand, the research is clear. I've reviewed much of it over the last 10 years that I've been looking at the issue, and we've just heard some of it summarized here. Land restrictions of all sorts are associated with higher housing costs, right? And not just green belts. The question then arises, can we establish causality, right? Does one cause the other? Just because two things happen together in time and space doesn't mean they cause one another. And none of the studies really have been able to establish causality. It could be, and I'm not the only one that's proposed that more expensive regions, faster growing regions, are the ones that actually want to implement tighter growth restrictions, right? Regions that are growing fast, makes sense that they may want to have a green belt because they're growing fast, right? You're not going to put a green belt in a place that's growing very slowly where prices aren't appreciating. And so that leads me kind of to the points I want to make here as my opening statement is then, well, so if not the Greenbelt, and I'm not going to disagree that the Greenbelt certainly, land restrictions have an impact on price. Just the question is, what's the degree relative to all the other factors that are impacting the price of housing and land? And I turn to the models of urban economics that were developed in the 1960s, but are still, and they're critiqued for various reasons from social geographers for not accounting for sort of social factors. But certainly, since we're sticking to primarily the economic factors today, these models developed by economists like Alonzo, Mills, and Muth, they look at land values not just in two-dimensional space of the demand and supply framework, but they add geography, right? And that's, of course, essential in my mind when we study land markets. And not just submarkets, but actually looking how land value varies over space. They depict land gradients, and I've, in a published work, have documented this with urban economist Andrea Skiberskis from Queens. We've looked at the Toronto land values across space, and as the models predict, it's highest in the center, and what they call the land value gradient kind of goes down, right? So you can imagine CN Tower, and there's the highest land value, and it kind of goes down towards the center. Now, what we also found, of course, is that there's sort of these rebounds, right? I don't know if that's making sense with the sort of hand waving, right? But there's the rebounds in secondary centers, secondary nodes where densities increased, where you're also seeing these secondary peaks of land values. But in the GTA, the highest concentration of jobs is still downtown and in and around the airport. And what that meant is that when you're then looking at, well, what's causing, as we follow the models here, the increases in land values, it's people's decisions trading off housing and commuting costs, right? It's about accessibility. Accessibility determines the value of land. I don't mean to insult you by suggesting location, location, location impacts the price of real estate, right? And so then it's actually, you can argue that when prices increase in the center of a major cities, which they tend to do when they become agglomerations of economic activity, right? And we want to have that agglomeration of economic activity. We all benefit from it. Toronto's downtown is a major center for service sector, knowledge sectors of the economy. That agglomeration benefits that economic sector, benefits the universities, Ryerson, University of Toronto, right? They're in the center of lots of activity. What that means is that there's lots of people who want to be close, pushing up the price of those central locations. Based on the economic theory is when you push up the price in the center, you get a proportional increase all throughout the rest of the metropolitan region. So you can have increases in the price of single-family homes just because the region is growing and because there's actually demand for the higher density center, not because there's a higher demand necessarily for single-family homes, right? Another factor I want to point to is the government withdrawal from the housing system, sort of starting in the 80s, 90s in particular. We used to have a fairly well-regulated housing market with a national housing policy. We've lost a lot of that. In the 1980s, we built between 15 and 20,000 units of affordable housing under the National Housing Act. In the 2000s, we built around 1,000 per year. So from about 15 to 20,000 down to about 1,000. Now, we're talking about housing affordability here, not affordable housing, which is for a particular sector. But nonetheless, all these people who are not now being housed by government-assisted housing are now competing in the market, right? So you have a higher demand for market housing. We also have policies promoting home ownership. We think it's a good thing, right? In general, it probably is, such as first-time homebuyer credits, very low interest rates, construction subsidies. I recently learned that the OECD looked at all the OECD countries to figure out which country had the highest construction subsidies for owner-occupied housing. Chile was first, Canada was second. Canada has the second highest subsidies for construction sector for the owner-occupied housing. The same report also demonstrated that countries promoting home ownership create distortions in the market in that developers are then more likely to invest in own housing, not building rental housing, and that individuals are also more likely to enter the home ownership market than if those incentives weren't in place. So really what I'm getting at is actually policies and regulations promoting home ownership are actually in part a factor increasing the price of housing because you increase demand for ownership artificially. There's also the foreign investment, and perhaps slightly more important, I would argue, the foreign equity component. I've done research where I've looked at Vancouver's housing market in particular, and was able to show that there's what I call the decoupling of the labor and the housing market. There's people who are able to afford housing that based on the income, you wouldn't expect them to, right? And so then there's sort of the question, well, where does the income come from? And we know from other studies that there's actually a good share of immigrants who are able to bring equity from outside the country into the housing market and thus push up the demand for housing. This is not an argument against immigration. I'm an immigrant myself to Canada, but it suggests that those policies have an impact on housing affordability. I also want to create kind of a comparison between a business case and an economic analysis. If I wanted to create a business case for single-family housing, I would look at demand factors, right? Household formations, incomes, and I would look at land supply. And I could easily make a business case that there's not going to be sufficient supply for the demand for single-family homes, perhaps. And we should build more to reduce price. If I were making an economic case for the Greenbelt, then I would have to look at the cost and benefits of the Greenbelt itself, not just its impact on housing. The natural capital, or some calling the ecosystem services of the Greenbelt itself, there's an economic value to that. The agritourism, leisure, recreation associated with the Greenbelt, there's an economic value associated with that. The cost of extending public infrastructure into new greenfield areas. An infrastructure deficit already exists in this country for almost consistently across, so we should grow even more at the suburban fringe. The cost of automobile ownership. We're not comparing apples to apples when we compare perhaps a higher density housing forum in a central area with a lower density housing forum in a more suburban area that is relying on, primarily in many cases, on the automobile, which both has a higher economic impact or economic cost on the individual in terms of automobile ownership, but also has a high economic impact on society through congestion, right? That's lost productivity. And we know as planners, there's been many studies that document how low-density suburban development is associated with higher automobile use and the associated congestion, the associated pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, which are contributing to climate change. There's an economic cost to that. One of the biggest funders these days of climate change research, I don't know if they're the biggest, but I certainly hear lots from some of my colleagues about funding pools from insurance companies. They're interested in it, right, in climate change, because it costs them a lot of money. Sprawl, low-density suburban development, is part of the reason we're having higher greenhouse gas emissions. There's a cost to it. I've also talked about the value gradient, and I've talked about the urban economic models. I also want to talk about the labor market just very quickly. And we're sort of suggesting that there's changes in demand and things like that, but I mean, you can't really look at the housing market without considering the labor market, and they are clearly, there's a lot of evidence that considers the restructuring of the economy at the global scale to be one of the most important factors in creating more flexible, part-time, and contract jobs that are contributing to the polarization of the income distribution. Higher income earners are seeing their income increase in share, lower income earners are seeing their incomes decline. What that does in the housing market, of course, is that suddenly now you have a lot of demand for luxury housing, and you have a lot of people who are maybe willing to pay for housing, right, but they're not able to pay for housing because there's not a market to build housing for people who can't afford it. We have also seen that increasing ownership rates among young adults are largely driven by high-income earners, while the young adults with the lower incomes actually saw their ownership rates decline. Now, Canada is the 9th country among OECD countries, 27 in total, and above the OECD average in a share of renters facing affordability burdens. but it's 16th, well below the OECD average, in the share of owners facing affordability burdens. We have a rental affordability problem in this country and in our cities, as David Hoshansky, I think, in his research would also attest to. And we're not going to solve the rental affordability problem by building single-family homes at the fringe that are targeted at the ownership market. Yes, we might argue that expanding any segment of the market is going to lead to filtering of the housing stock down to lower income earners. But research has been done across Canadian cities, and one study in particular by Andres Skiberskis, who I mentioned before, who's almost definitively said filtering is not taking place, meaning that housing is not filtering down in central areas to lower income earners. And we all know that just intuitively to be the case. Look around downtown Toronto. It's getting more expensive. It's not the lower income earners moving in. So what you need is housing in the areas where people actually want to be. You need to add supply in the areas where there are the jobs, where there's the concentration in the knowledge economy that's the driver of our growth these days. If we're concerned about GDP growth, we need to make sure people can get to the jobs that are driving our growth and economic success, right? And with that, I want to kind of conclude. I'm probably towards the end of my time. We've seen that ownership is actually more expensive in many other national or urban contexts. We can't just look at the average single-family dwelling home, particularly because, and that was just in the news today again, it's the luxury market that actually often tips that average up quite a bit, and that would be consistent with the theory of occupational polarization, right? It's the higher income earners who are buying into the expensive housing market. We have to also look in how we actually get people to buy houses, right? And this is a question of financial engineering, mortgage instruments. Switzerland, where I grew up, people generally rent, and those who own in a very different structure that I won't get into now, but there's financial instruments the banks have designed that allow people to own housing even though the price is much higher, right? And it generally involves paying over longer periods of time. And somehow, we have a mortgage model that we developed largely sort of in the 1950s, and we've stuck to it. And the 25-year mortgage is the only model that we seem to be able to come up with to allow people to afford housing. It's crazy to me. We may hold, and that's the last thing I'll say for now, we may hold an opinion that we should all be able to afford ground-oriented single-family homes. But that doesn't mean that it's good public policy that looks at the costs and the economic benefits of different types of land development patterns. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marcus. Russell, do you want to
Sure.
make some comments?
That was the last part of that was something I wasn't really expecting in this discussion. There is an issue, of course, with providing housing at the lower end of the market, and I wouldn't dispute that. And likewise, there are issues with rental housing because we don't really build much of it, and there's no question about that. However, we also are in North America, where there is a high value placed on home ownership. But anyway, that wasn't really an issue I was thinking of talking about tonight. So I'll actually kind of go back to a bit about some of the things I agree with. Is that first of all, the Greenbelt really has not much to do with this. Maybe in the 2050s it'll have something to do with it, but for now there's a lot of land around inside the Greenbelt. The current problem with supply is much more related to service supply, and that is partly related to the growth plan, indirectly really because it's taken such a long time to approve new land to come on stream, but it's also related to providing infrastructure and the regions and how that's financed. Now, so there's a whole lot of complexities there. But what we do know is that there is a shortage of supply. So not only in the central city do we have bidding wars for houses when they come up, and we've seen a rapid escalation in price, but I've been hearing stories for several years now about when you actually get servicing, you put up a sales pavilion, people camp out overnight for the opening of a sales pavilion when single attached houses go on sale in places like York Region or Flamborough or or wherever, and places like Seaton, which is enormous. When that comes on stream next year, you're going to see more houses built there more quickly than you can imagine. There's an enormous demand that far exceeds the supply, and every other product that's ever been around means that the price goes up. And so therefore, we are using the price mechanism to ration the land. Now, some of that's to do with the current service supply. The growth plan, however, over the longer term, is very deliberately limiting the supply of ground-related housing in hopes of more people living in apartment-type housing in an intensified environment, all of which is fine, but it does, of necessity, use the pricing mechanism to get there, because you're restricting the supply of the product compared to what people would want. And if that isn't true, then the growth plan is not doing anything. I think the growth plan is doing something. So therefore, it's restricting supply, and therefore, it has an effect on price. It can't not do that. As far as the new growth plan goes, there's a couple of things I want to say about that. First of all, a notion of transparency and evidence-based policy. What is being proposed, it's one thing about the growth plan we have now, what is being proposed is quite a radical advancement of. This isn't tweaking the thing we're doing. This is taking what is already the most tightly regulated regional plan ever attempted in Canada and the United States for a large urban area, and probably more than Europe for the most part, and then advancing it not by a little increment, but by doubling down, as David said. But at the same time, there doesn't seem to be a lot of work. I don't see the evidence behind this about what the effects are. I would like to understand what the effects are of this, particularly in housing affordability, which is our subject now, but there's lots of other areas. And, I just haven't really quite seen the work on this. And this is a big deal, and a big deal deserves some careful analysis and work. And then let's say I haven't really seen that. And finally, I think it's important that we have a balance in policy. One, I think, we all kind of agree in this room that it would be great to have more transit use. We want more intensification. We want denser greenfield development. We have that, notwithstanding the remarks about the economy of suburban areas, and certainly American places are a little different, is that as it stands right now, we build by far the densest suburbs being built now or anywhere in Canada and the United States, and they're denser than they mostly build them in the UK. So we actually have made great advances here, and we're way ahead of the curve here. But when you go to the new growth plan, as far as I can figure, ignoring some of the oddities in that, which I'm sure the good people at Municipal Affairs will figure out, some of the things that don't quite work, but you take the broad policy proposal, is that basically we would be moving to a housing environment which is about 75% apartments, maybe about 15% rows, and about 10% singles. So this is a very, very dense notion. And so that's really a gigantic shift from what we've had before. And if you look at a place like, say, France, so the country of France and Ile-de-France, which is the Paris metropolitan area, they for a very long time and currently do about 50% ground-related and 50% apartments. And that's actually what we're doing right now in the GTA. That may or may not last, depending on a few factors. But this new plan is really trying to basically out-France the French. And when we used to look at Europe as the model that we aspire to, we're actually seem to be aspiring to something that's like super Europe. So I'm not quite sure what that. So it is a really big thing. It will have a lot of effects on things, and so this, and we had like a really good agreement here. We have a good growth plan. It really pushed the boundaries, and it achieved a really good balance. Or I think, a few things need to be tweaked and such, but it achieved a really good balance between these things. And now we're actually suggesting moving away from that balance and moving like way over here. And the thing that worries me the very most about that is that in public policy, when you push things too far, is that democracy and a market economy almost always undoes them on you. So my biggest worry is that if the new growth plan is approved as demonstrated in 10 years, we will be worse off from all the things that we want to achieve about transit and density. We might end up being worse off in 10 years with the new growth plan than we would if we just kept the one we had. And that worries me a great, great deal. So with that, I'll turn it over.
Thanks very much, Russell. Pamela, for your remarks.
Sure. Thank you very much, and thank you to the ULI. I think it's a great opportunity to discuss some different perspectives on a very pressing issue. I guess when I was thinking about this, and I should put the disclaimer out front, just like David did, I'm not an economist, although he is an economist. I'm not an economist, but I'm really interested in the interaction between planning and the economy. I think taking the economy into account makes planning better. And we need to also understand what are the economic implications of some of the planning policies that we're putting in place. When I was thinking about this, I guess what I was really trying to struggle with is why now? So, we've experienced, I think, really in the last 5 years, a serious uptick in the price affordability issue. So. I think that's something really important to keep in mind is, what are the factors that are actually having that impact now and in the last 5 years? And just in that vein, I think it's also important to keep a broad perspective. So, the question that we're supposed to be dealing with here is it all about the growth plan and is it about the Greenbelt? And I think it is important to have a broader discussion, and I think there's been a lot of great points raised already that suggest that it's not really obviously one thing. It's supply and demand, and I think it's global factors and local factors, and I think we have to think of both of those. So when thinking about what are some of the things that have changed recently, obviously, globally mobile capital is one thing that I think has been on the increase, and it's something that I'm really interested in terms of globalization and how do cities fit into this, and what are the impacts on planning. And I think that is, there's a lot of global capital out there looking for somewhere to land profitably. Toronto is very, very attractive. It's politically stable. We have a great financial system. It's a dynamic place. So obviously it's a place that's very attractive to globally mobile capital. And I'm not just talking here about private capital, I'm talking about corporate capital, institutional capital. So I think these are, this is something that's relatively new and could have impacts in terms of price pressures locally. And the other thing that obviously hasn't been mentioned that is critically important is the sustained hyper low interest rates that we've had, which obviously are a boost to demand and improve affordability, but also push the demand for housing up. And that's particularly since 2008, since the global financial crisis of 2008. So I think sometimes we think, this bump, this increase in housing prices coincides with the growth plan, so therefore, those two things are causally related. So those are some of these sort of global demand side things. I think on the supply side, obviously there's several things, we haven't really talked much about demographics, local demographics, but I think really on the planning side, which is really what we're supposed to be focusing on today, I agree that in general, planning and land use regulation is something that can have an impact on affordability. I think that it really depends on the nature of planning and the execution of that planning and planning regulation. I think we have to be very specific about the mechanisms that we're talking about and not just say, the Greenbelt is containment and therefore, house prices are going up. I think we need to delve a lot more deeply into what are the specific mechanisms. And I think personally, specifically with respect to the growth plan, I actually think it has very little impact on affordability, and particularly the affordability of greenfields housing for reasons that we can get into. I think the impact of it is overstated both by those who think it's great and by those who think it's having negative impacts. And I think the Greenbelt, I agree completely with Russell, has even less impact in terms of impact on housing affordability. What I do think, and this is me agreeing with Dave, is that Richard Joy told us, by the way, we have to agree on at least one thing with the opponents. So here, I've already agreed twice. So
well done.
I can tick those off already. I'm done. Planning and land use regulation, I do agree it's important. I think it's especially important the way we regulate land use in the already urbanized area. And I think, in fact, that probably has a more significant impact in terms of price impacts. and in terms of restrictions than what we're doing at the fringe. So I think it is important to have a broad discussion around drivers and what are the impacts, and also to make sure that when we're talking about affordability, we're not just focused on affordability of ground-related housing at the edge. I think the issue is a bit broader than that.
Great. Thanks, Pamela. So we're going to get into some questions. I thought I'd first kick it off, given that I have the microphone. I'll ask a couple of questions. One of the things that I'm really curious about, I mean, I think in a lot of ways the growth plan and the Greenbelt have had a lot of intended consequences as it relates to the housing market, and one of the express purposes was promoting intensification. So I'm just curious whether anyone wants to sort of tackle this issue about affordability, not just of low-rise, but affordability generally. Because one of the things that we didn't talk much about is the affordability of high-rise housing, and as well as the supply of high-rise housing. When you look at the numbers for high-rise, the number of units are much higher than they used to be. The unsold inventory is much higher. Prices have really not risen nearly as quickly as they have for low-rise housing. So really, that's effectively what those provincial policies were trying to accomplish. I'm just curious whether anyone has an opinion about effectively the why is it better to have affordable low-rise versus high-rise? Is that a bad thing?
Oh, so you ended with a question that was slightly different from what I was going to answer. But one of the things that I had in my notes here, and I kind of forgot because I kind of went off into planning there and kind of lost the thread of the affordability there. But one of the really interesting things that's happened in the last 10 years, and CMHC has tracked this, is that what you see is that the price of single-detached dwellings has gone up much more rapidly than the price of high-rise dwellings, and the same is true in Vancouver as well. So we have these two markets with this highly restricted ground-related housing supply, and again, that tells us that the restriction does have that price effect, and indeed the price. So that tells us that the actual whether the growth plan is responsible for this or not, we can talk about another time. But what the growth plan, if implemented, would have exactly this effect, which is to say we are providing way more supply of higher density, high-rise housing, and we are restricting the supply of ground-related housing, and therefore you'd expect the price differential to grow. So it's actually following exactly as one would predict if it was just the growth plan and the restrictions of it in isolation. Now, of course, 1,001 other things happen, like low interest rates and all that sort of thing, which affect all sorts of matters. But nevertheless, we are seeing that pattern, which is clearly in favor of what the growth plan is seeking to do. So, in fact, it actually is working by using the price mechanism. Whether it's really responsible for it or not, we can talk about another time.
Any comments on this? Sure.
I guess there's one point that seems to come back up again and again, just in these first few minutes, is that somehow it's as simple as, if we see a rise in the price of single-family homes, somehow that must be the growth plan restrictions. I'm just not quite following it. It's as if we're treating the market for housing like the market for T-shirts, right? There's regulatory factors that are, there's so many submarkets that are very poorly understood. There's not just two submarkets, single-family homes and high-rises, right? Also, there's, as I mentioned before, there's the geography of housing. It matters where housing is, and it matters that some are closer to employment centers than others. And it matters that there's a rental sector and an owner sector, and to have a conversation about whether a Greenbelt impacts housing affordability of ground-oriented dwelling, that's having a conversation that already kind of has a set answer, and that leads to a particular kind of outcome. Hence, my argumentation around the importance of renting and consideration of public policy more generally, of how it influences the affordability of housing, because if we don't have that conversation, we're going to end up somewhere where we say, well, it must be the Greenbelt, prices are going up, we're going to get rid of the Greenbelt. You can keep a Greenbelt and you can make housing affordable. You just have to use the right policy instruments, right? And I think that's being overlooked when we sort of zero in on the price effects of a Greenbelt. And I'm not, maybe that's my point of agreement. I'm not disagreeing that land restrictions will have an impact on price. But the question is, do you want to have those land restrictions in place? And that's where we venture from, pure abstract demand and supply curves to actually democratic, Russell mentioned, democratic decision-making. When we enter the democratic policy-making process where we say, well, what do you want our housing stock to be 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, right? Are we planning for the demand that we see right now? If we go to the demographic and just look at what people are currently owning, of course you're going to draw the conclusion that single-family homes are what people prefer. There's a concept called latent demand, right? And so there's demand for something, but people can't buy it. And a good indicator of that is when you know, how quickly a lot of these transit-oriented developments sell out is a good indicator of latent demand for those kinds of places, right? So there is a demand for those places. You can make that kind of same argument. And so we can go argue back and forth about, well, that same thing happens with single-family homes. Well, we're living in a growing region. So there's lots of people demanding housing, right? You'd expect that.
Dave, do you want to make a comment?
Yeah, just a couple of points. One is that I'm not sure the intent was to drive, the growth plan was to drive housing prices for ground-associated units in 905 that high. I would think that looking at the infrastructure available to build is part of the problem on the supply side, and that I'm not suggesting that there should be sprawl. I'm looking at housing being built there according to the densities proposed for greenfields in the growth plan, and that's not happening. That supply is not coming on stream. And they can be around communities that are kind of, local transit-oriented in 905. They don't have to be sprawl. And that's not happening. That's part of the issue I see, providing that choice for people. At the same time, we're missing a whole other segment in terms of rental. There's not very much purpose-built rental. And I'm not sure that's a result of the growth plan, but it's something that needs to be addressed in some fashion. There's more built last year, I think, than there was in the past 5 years before that. So that's beginning to come on stream a little bit. And then there's a whole other areas. There's ground-associated mid-rise in 416. That's not being addressed. How do you encourage that? So there's a whole range of issues that have to be addressed on all types of housing. I was focusing on the major increase in affordability in ground-associated units because that's one of the things that I think has been very sticking out like a sore thumb and could be addressed. And also, there's the issue of the millennials, according to the research we've seen recently, are looking for ground-associated units. So give some options to the young people. They're not capitalizing in the great wealth gain of the people who already own housing, so at least give them some housing options to live where they want with their families.
Great. So why don't we open it up to the floor for questions? Also, just remember, if you want to submit your questions electronically, you can do so through toronto@uli.org or the Electric Cities hashtag. We also have microphones walking around at the back. If you want to raise your hand to ask a question. Yeah, here. Maybe just stand up and say your name so that everyone can hear.
Hi, my name is Raghu. I have a question for Marcus in particular. So the benefits of the Greenbelt are going to be equally distributed, more or less, but the costs are not being equally distributed. I think this really sucks, right? So I don't think the policy you're putting forward is going to have a lot of distributional effects that were not intended. So I don't.
So
what's the question?
Yeah, what's the question?
The question is, there will be distributional effects because of the Greenbelt that were not intended. Is that something we want?
Yeah, it's an interesting question about the distributional effects. I don't agree with you that actually the benefits are equally distributed. They're clearly not. If you're actually looking at the Greenbelt from a social equity perspective, you could say that the benefits actually heavily accrue to homeowners in and around the Greenbelt who have direct access with automobiles to using the Greenbelt, right? A low-income renter living in the inner suburbs of Toronto, what's the benefit of the Greenbelt? You can't get to it without a car. So I don't agree with that they're equally distributed. In terms of the costs, well, yeah, they're unequally distributed, but what about the costs of not containing sprawl? They're also unequally distributed, and they're very much put into the future, right? And so these policies are trying to add some costs to today's development patterns so that it's not all on the future generations to deal with the environmental, the social, and the economic costs of sprawl.
How about imposing a density taxation format so that the speculation would stop, because that's what's happening right now. If we know the population is going to keep increasing, if anything, we're probably going to increase immigration. The concentration of immigrants in Vancouver and Toronto is probably going to continue. So unless you have some sort of mechanism to prevent, because most of the people that live in Toronto, they're not very wealthy, especially the older people. If you put in a density-based taxation model, a floor space indexation, such as they have in Japan, that would prevent, or that would allow the supply to come on. Because one of the big things you see right now is if you look at where the condos are being built, they're not being built on, on main roads, for instance. They're happening at further in because of land assembly requirements. So if somebody was going to buy up houses to build a condo, there are issues, and then there's speculation going on, where a person would come in and buy the 8th house needed to build up sufficient number before you can build sufficient space to build a condo. What you're seeing is you're seeing plazas and other warehouses and stuff being built into condos, and they're not even adjacent to the main road.
Okay, thanks for the comment. Is there any other questions?
Can I speak to his, just very quickly?
Sure, go ahead.
I think, I'm not familiar with the specific taxation or example of Japan you mentioned, but, I mean, nobody's arguing that you just keep things as it is and put the Greenbelt in place, right? I think we're all, I think that's another point of agreeing, or fundamentally, there's an issue with housing affordability. I mean, one thing that one could argue for is something like a Ricardian land tax, and then you could argue that there's a lot of benefit being drawn in private property appreciation that is actually partly produced by public investments in amenities and in infrastructure, in parks and green spaces, in waterfront, redevelopment, beautification and so forth, so that you could tax some of the profit away. And in some ways, if you're dealing with it actually at the capital gains level or at the profit level, you're also not sort of, if you're dealing with it at the local municipal level where, like inclusionary zoning, yes, has some benefits, but some of those costs are just going to be pushed directly from the developers onto the consumer. So it makes sense to have actually more national or at least provincial level policies to deal with some of the price escalations.
There's a question, in the front here. Oh, sorry, okay, let's go here first.
Hi, my name's AJ. Oh, sorry, that was loud. Got a big voice. So this question I think will predominantly be for David and Russell, but I'd also like to hear maybe Marcus and Pamela's thoughts on it. David, you had spoken quite a lot about the problem with the growth plan targets, especially in new greenfield developments. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on those and what your thoughts are around the problem with them. And then also, is the home ownership dream and sort of this low density dream that we often associate with the American dream, not a creation of policy that's been embedded for 50, 60 years in the United States and Canada, and not also embedded developer philosophy? I mean, developers specialize in types of development, so new kinds of development like mid-rise and high-rise, they may not have the expertise or need to get in that sector. So is it not just a chicken and the egg problem where the developer wants to continue building low-rise housing because that's what they know?
I'm not sure I can speak for the development industry, but I think they build and adapt to where there's profitability. If those products are profitable, they're going to adapt to that. And in terms of the targets, I didn't really say there's a problem with the current targets. I'm concerned more about the projected ones because there hasn't been the analysis undertaken. As Russell pointed out already, you'd see that our density of our suburban greenfield development is much more dense than any U.S. city. Like people come here, they go, you concerned about that density? And of course, we have the current regulations in place that have a reasonable density. So it's not sprawling single-family houses, it's ground-associated units generally. And why ground-associated units? Because the single-family ones are really pricey. So semi-detached and townhouses are more affordable for people who are trying to get into the entry level of the market. So I think those products are very, very important for people who want ground-associated units for some family reason. Not everybody wants that. Other people want to be in the city. Problem in the city, of course, is that the condos being built are very small for families. They build very few 2- and 3-bedroom units. And I've been told by people who do analysis of condo markets that the 2 and 3 bedroom units are getting higher and higher demand currently. But because there are millennials who want to live in the city and have a family unit, part of the problem is those units often don't sell until the end of the project because they want to see what the building's like. They don't want to move a family into a place with young people who are kind of their party central. So we're not building enough family kind of condos in downtown Toronto, which is another market niche that's missing, partly because of the cost factor of building that size unit.
Great. Thank you. Can we get a microphone over here?
I have a question from email from
Okay.
Ali, and they want to know, what would the impact of autonomous vehicles on housing and urban growth policies?
That's a
I don't
big
know who
one.
that's directed towards.
Anyone want to try to tackle that one?
We have a book coming out next year that has a chapter on that very subject. Maybe we leave it till then.
Okay, great. Yeah, different panel for that question, I think. Okay.
Hello, hi. My name is Jay. I just have a question. I was wondering whether someone can address the role of government that you think should or will take going forward in terms of sustaining the GTA's house affordability. I mean, Canada hasn't been having the reputation of running a policy-controlled economy until BC started introducing 15% foreign ownership taxes, and Australia is even worse right now. Just what do you guys think about the federal government as well as the Ontario government going forward is going to do to keep that in balance? Thanks.
Anyone want to tackle that one?
Well, gathering around foreign investors and saying, which, it's all your fault, is not actually that helpful. And, really, I mean, it may be a trigger point in the BC market, but really, it's just not that big of a thing. I mean, it may not be that great, but this thing is not being, this whole price run-up is not being run just by the growth plan, and it's certainly not the problem with foreign investors. There's a whole lot of things going on here, and it's very complicated, and it's very high priced, and, Australia is the only other place in the world that's actually worse than we are. And they actually don't really have much in the way of planning controls compared to what we have either, and it's still running up. So, there's a lot of other things going on here, but picking a couple of little elements like just the growth plan or just the service land or just foreign investors is not actually that helpful because it's a very big, complicated thing, and it includes things like rental housing and all the things that we've been discussing. So that's important to keep in mind.
So maybe one thing I would ask, just to build on that, to maybe get a comment from all four of you, each of you. If you could change one thing to improve affordability, what do you think a policy change that would get the most sort of bang for your buck in terms of impact on affordability without potentially creating other negative consequences? Anyone want to?
I'll start.
Sure, Pamela.
Okay, so as I mentioned before, I think probably the bigger planning restriction is with the already urban area outside of the downtown of Toronto. We have a very reactive kind of planning system. We wait for development applications to come in, and then the planning department responds. In municipalities that have greenfields, it is proactive. On greenfields development, they're always, churning out, more communities. They're planning new communities. They're figuring out how to do that. That's something that's ongoing all the way. So in one sense, it is more proactive for greenfields development. So I think there is, as we've talked about, various kind of missing parts to the market. And there was also a piece from the Ryerson City Building Institute about mid-rise. We're missing a lot of pieces of the market, particularly outside of the downtown, sort of between the downtown of Toronto and the urban edge. And there's a lot of opportunity for that kind of more mid-rise, sort of smaller scale density. But what that would require, I think, is to move out of this reactive mode, because that is basically, putting a limit on the supply at any one time, which could also have a price impact. So I think one of the things to do would be to put a really big push on identifying strategic areas across the region, especially outside of the downtown, where there's infrastructure capacity, where there's amenity, where it's close to jobs, and where people want to live, and proactively rezone those areas on a large scale across the city. So you're introducing a whole new supply, basically of potential opportunity at once, and also making it easier for developers to come in without having to deal with the uncertainty of rezoning, the costliness. These are things that actually the Fraser Institute identified as being some of the major drivers of price with respect to the planning approvals process. So to sort of have a big effort to rezone proactively strategic areas of the region, across the region. Similar in a way to something they did in New York City during the Bloomberg years. They proactively rezoned over 11,000 blocks of New York City, not only in Manhattan, but in the boroughs as well.
That might also have an impact to reduce the speculation that occurs.
Exactly.
Yeah. Anyone else want to?
I think, Pamela, you're younger than I am, but you're defining what Seton was to be many years ago. But let's continue. There's not one item. I think Pamela hit a lot of it, that you really have to expand the supply in a lot of different ways for a lot of different types of housing, and that includes in 905, as she suggested, includes in the city. One of the things that's maybe tinkering at the edges, but we talked about at our research center, was that those industrial lands that aren't really going to be used in the city, they should be converted to residential, but they should be have constraints on them that they are tied to ground-related or mid-rise units when they're converted. So I think part of the problem is that I hear from people in affordable housing in the city that the Economic Development Department doesn't want to lease any of those lands, but some of them really are not really going to be used for employment purposes. So that might be one approach. The other approach is, as Pamela said, to make rezoning a little simpler, maybe to using building permits in some areas so there's less restriction, you can move things along more quickly. There's not one thing, there's a number of things that I think have to be done, a whole suite of proposals, I think, from the provincial and local governments.
Yeah, no, I was just looking for your sort of top of the list one that you would pick first.
Yeah.
Russell, do you want to?
And I entirely agree with Pamela on this. You know, the thing about when you look at it from a demographic perspective is that we still need a lot of family-oriented housing, and you know, those big high-rises we build are not very good for that. Mom, dad, 2 kids, and hockey equipment just does not work in a 1-bedroom plus den in Liberty Village. I mean, like, that's a really hard thing to operate with, and most people don't want to. And yes, the hipsters in Liberty Village will grow up and do that one of these days, and they need someplace to go. And to me, the much of the solution to all of this is really around row housing. And so it's denser ground-related housing is very good for the family-oriented housing we need. It gives you a little bit of a backyard and easy parking and all that sort of stuff. You can do a lot of it in the vast middle between downtown and the urban edge, but you probably have to do some of it beyond the urban edge, but it's dense greenfield development. So all this talk about, you know, singles and large lots and sprawl and all that, like David and I aren't talking about that at all. We're talking about very dense, a small amount of very dense greenfield development, but some of it, because you can't provide enough family-oriented housing just through the redevelopment process, or it's very difficult to, it seems.
And hopefully
I'd like to,
with some transit attached to it,
yeah.
get people around.
Derek, if I can may.
Sure.
So I'd like to speak to that, Russell. I agree with you in terms of having to provide family housing, and a lot of that has to come in the form of probably mid-rise or, you know, sort of a little bit denser. But we also have to question about our own assumptions about what actually families need and how we view that, right? You talked about hockey equipment and mom and dad. Well, you know, what about my soccer playing family with dad, and mom, or mom and me, right? There's a diversity of families, and we can't just assume there's one type of family, and I'm not suggesting that was your intent, but we have to have this conversation about what family housing is without going into it just assuming that every family has 2 kids, a mom and a dad, and a dog and a half, or however that analogy usually goes, right?
Great. Richard?
Yeah, Richard Joy, Executive Director, and I apologize for being late. I had a
great trip from Vancouver by way of North Bay, but I'm here. Here's a question. I really want to pick up on this thread right now around the idea of getting to the ability to intensify more of the existing urban. A lot of the heavy lifting, notwithstanding the growth plan, I'll call it 2.0, as it's emerging, putting higher targets and public policy expectations on more intensification, the heavy lifting politically still falls to municipalities to deliver on that zoning, especially around critical areas. I would think of provincial interest, where there's massive infrastructure investments being made in transportation and transit specifically. Is that right? I'm asking all of you. I think we have a debate on the edge, but inside our urban cores, perhaps there's not as much debate that we need to open up the ability to develop more readily, but we're still facing the resistance of just about every part of our region being underzoned, and that the political level that has to do that zoning is the municipal one, which is the most politically sensitive to local communities and therefore very resistant, as we've seen time and time again, often requiring the OMB to override political decisions at the municipal level. Are we at a point right now where there are very important parts of provincial interests around massive investments of their dollars and federal dollars that they should actually impose some kind of minimum zoning in these kinds of circumstances?
I don't think it's actually a problem. Is that if you work in most of the suburban municipalities these days, they have so embraced all this idea about intensification and urban growth centers and all that sort of thing. I mean, the city of Mississauga has dreams of development that are frankly getting rather unrealistic about how much you can fit in there. But they have ideas about putting tens of thousands of apartment units over that thing and growing to 1 million people, some of them. And so and Vaughan and Markham aren't that different. They really have embraced this. So, obviously it's located in certain places, but really it's always overstated the resistance of neighbors. Yes, neighbors never like stuff. The City of Toronto turns down applications all the time, but it's mostly that, we were going to approve a 20 times coverage building and you want a 22 times coverage, and the OMB figures that out. But, there was a time not very long ago when, 8 times coverage was a lot, and then there's a building across the street here, I read today that, the city did turn down for 37 times coverage. So, I mean, like, how far do you go? And 25 times would have probably sailed through. So, we actually have embraced density, not in mowing over neighborhoods and land assemblies and that sort of thing, not this 1960s style, but really everywhere else is mostly pretty well approvable. And it's a pretty subtle difference between what's opposed and what's approved. So.
Pamela?
I would just add one thing, which is I think if it's done proactively and on an area basis, it should be something that's a lot more palatable rather than, again, the reactive model where you get all of a sudden an application for a 37-story building in your backyard and nobody's really dealing with the area issues. If you can anticipate development and then involve the community up front and figure out the framework before the development applications arrives, then I think that's something that's a lot more palatable. And that combined, I think, with sticking to the framework once it's put in place, I think that's a really important part of it, so that residents know, okay, once we approve this is actually going to be what happens and how this neighborhood, Main Street evolves or whatever over time. And I think that makes it much more politically acceptable.
Great. Do you still have a question? You've been waiting patiently.
I had.
Can we get the microphone over here?
No, it's okay. Can you hear me? I had a few questions. Thanks. I had a few questions, 2 of which have been answered already. So just a very quick question for Russ, and I know, Russ, we did this years ago. We worked out the capacity. Just as an aside, I still think this business of whether or not the Greenbelt's actually a constraint to development and when and how, back a while ago, we estimated, what the actual capacity of the White Belt was, like between the end of the urban area and the Greenbelt. Do you have any sense of what that is now under the new targets? Like, have you guys done anything, even on the back of a napkin, on like how much land is in there, like how much, like even at current development patterns? I mean, how many years, if it was all just designated would that last us? Maybe under the current plan and under the sort of double down plan.
Yeah. Well,
the answer might be no. It's okay. I'm just wondering if you did it.
Well, we had done that before, and under the current growth plan, I know we're about getting close to 7 million in GTA Hamilton now. We can certainly accommodate 10, maybe 11, depending on some of the assumptions within the Greenbelt. So that's why I say the Greenbelt isn't a problem until the 2050s. So we have lots of time for this place to grow a lot in quite a dense way within the Greenbelt. So that's not terribly restrictive, except for some local markets like Grimsby, for instance, where it's just all hemmed in and that. But for the most part, York and Peel and all of that have plenty of white belt land should it be designated for development.
Yeah, Pamela.
I would just add a couple of factlets to that. So this is based on the Neptis Foundation. They've actually, they did an analysis of the first 5 years using satellite imagery of how much land had been actually urbanized in the 2031 boundary. So if you extrapolate that out, that would give you another 40 more years within the 2031 boundary from today, basically. So in other words, within the 2031 boundary, that takes you out to 2046. That's before you get to the white belt. And then so the white belt would give you the same rate, another 44 years. And that's not including the 2031 boundary beyond the green belt in the outer ring.
So we're talking literally, we're talking about theoretically hundreds of years. So we're talking about literally hundreds of years of potential supply in the white belt.
Well, certainly in Port Colborne and Townsend there is.
Marcus, you want to touch on that?
Yeah, and then what happens also over that time frame, as somebody from the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing reminded me, is that so by 2031, the youngest of those 65 plus will be 90 years old, meaning that virtually all those, and they occupy about 370,000 ground-related units outside of the City of Toronto, will come to market, which could house over 1.1 million people. And they sort of go through the analysis of how the aging of the population, and regardless of what we assume about downsizing, right, that's a sort of a separate question, but just in terms of household dissolution, you're going to see stock become available. The other thing to remember is that generally it's about 1 to 2% of all stock is new stock added in any given year, right? And it's about 75% of all stock sold in a given year is existing stock. So a lot of housing is going back and forth within the existing housing stock. So that 1 and 2% are really indicative of what's happening in the rest of the market is also a question that actually requires consideration.
Great. Any other questions from the floor?
So I was just wondering if potentially one of the factors that's associated with this is the fact that our new housing that we're building, be it the condos here or the townhouses being built further outside the core, is really high quality, expensive housing to build. So it's hard for it to be cheap. It's hard for it to be affordable because we're building with cement, we're building with elevators, or we're building up to building codes that are really high and really make housing a lot more expensive. So yes, we can add supply, but that supply will always be, like if we could build more infinitely, would that supply always be expensive because of the codes that we're building to these days?
It's an interesting question. Just as a developer, I almost always hear the opposite, that builders are building terrible housing that's not going to last. So I'm really curious to hear that comment. Does anyone want to make a comment on that?
Well, actually, we just talked about that at lunch today at the office, is that if you look at, a lot of places in the United States, they build a lot of quite affordable, relatively dense units, so like low-rise apartments, and they don't have elevators, they don't, they aren't very energy efficient, and maybe it doesn't matter as much there. They have outdoor corridors, and they have all sorts of things. And we don't do any of that here. So we do the housing we build here for lots of good reasons, but that's the balance in policy is really expensive because it has to be accessible. You have to have an elevator. We like underground parking. We don't want above grade parking. We want indoor corridors. We want we add all this energy efficiency and on it goes, all of which are very good things, but they do cost money. So there's always a trade-off there, and those are the balances we have to strike in setting policy.
And I agree with Russell. And what Derek was saying, probably when the houses fall down, but the granite countertops are still going to be there. But I want to tell you a story about Kansas City. And Kansas City, out of all places, I was at a conference in Houston last year, and a planner from there was telling me that they were, and I think this happens in other places too, but in Kansas, out of all places, right, go figure, they're building these empty shell apartments, right, and so literally it's a concrete shell with hookups for your plumbing, for your electricity. There's no flooring in there, right? It's bare. And I think the starting selling price for a 2-bedroom was $310,000 or something like that. And the story was that he was telling me was that the same building, apparently a former NBA player bought one of the units and basically decorated it in a way that the value of it was $900,000, and somebody else who was really thrifty could add the toilets and the floors and everything else for about $50,000, right? So you can have in the same building actually quite dramatically different interior furnishings. Now, this story was told to me in person, so I can't verify the exact numbers, but in principle, right, if we add a lot of things to our new housing units that used to be seen as luxury, clearly they're adding to the price. Now, how much are they adding to the price? That's kind of an empirical question, and I haven't come across, estimates of that.
Was there another? Yeah, there's a question over here.
And this is going to be a bit of an economics question, maybe for David. Just curiously, we've been told the story that you have to invest in housing, the prices go up, it's a great investment. It's been going up faster than many other investment vehicles for a long time. With the demographics and the aging population and baby boomers, are we putting ourselves in a really, really dangerous situation where many, many people are dependent on the value of their homes increasing to pay for their retirement and old age at the same time that the people who are going to buy those houses can no longer afford them? Where do you see that growth taking us?
Well, housing has two components to the demand for it. There's an investment demand and there's a consumption demand. So, I would often caution people about don't buy it for investment demand only. That, if you look at some of the approaches, if you're investment demand, you buy the most expensive house you can, hope it goes up, but you're betting a lot on that. So I think I'd be a little cautious about that and look at the demography, look at the changes. One of the things we continue to have in-migration, which is an important part of our growth. If we continue to have in-migration from other countries, then you're going to have home buyers coming on board. Whether or not they have the means to afford the houses is open to question. So you got to look at that as well as the kind of the aged demography of the current residents as well.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank everybody in this room who's under 30 for the enormous intergenerational transfer that they're going to provide to me in about 20 years' time.
Was there any other questions from the floor?
Well, that actually raises an interesting point. No, and I actually agree.
I'm kind of in jest, but it's kind of true.
It's actually, I'm just working on a paper that I'm presenting in Portland, out of all places. I think David's going to be there as well, later this year. And what I'm looking at is the ways in which parental gifts for down payments are impacting the kind of housing young adults are able to buy. And what you can clearly see is there's an ability to increasingly buy in more expensive markets if your parents previously owned, right? And so in some sense, we have this sort of sense as a society, well, yes, if I own the house, I should be able to pass it along. But what it of course does is create increasingly polarized society where those who at one point owned can pass that on to the children, and then those who rent can no longer get into the market, right? And so there's clearly, I know you say you're joking about it, but I think there's clearly actually an intergenerational equity issue here that we have, it goes beyond the Greenbelt, but the Greenbelt in and itself, of course, is an intergenerational equity question, right? How much Greenbelt, how much green space are we leaving our children, our grandchildren, and so forth?
And in California, you can actually will your 1981 tax rate to your children as well and pass that along too. So there's this enormous subsidy, the Proposition 13 result, which is just ridiculous now.
So another question that actually came through Twitter, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but just this question of when you look at affordability of housing, also look at transportation costs that are related to different types of housing. I wonder if anyone wants to comment on, looking at the broader picture of affordability when you think about choices that people are making. So potentially much higher transportation costs related to low-rise housing that aren't connected to transit versus potentially higher priced housing but connected to transit, and how that plays out in the whole affordability debate.
Well, that's the basic economic theory of Alonzo's land market. You trade off transportation costs versus location rents. So, I mean, that's what people do all the time.
But do we have any numbers for the GTA in terms of, where those numbers play out?
Well, I'm not sure it's been modeled. I think that there may be some modeling done by Metrolinx currently, but, I'm not privy to them. I think you look at some of those trade-offs, and I think people do it when they're buying, at least kind of informally. They trade that off. And of course, it's not only the cost of transportation in terms of car ownership or the transit fee, but it's also the time. So how people value the time affects that as well.
And the other issue with it, right, it's actually kind of, I added it to one of my lists before, right, when I talked about we have to compare all the costs, but the transportation one is actually kind of a tricky one because people can move into what we might think of as location-efficient places, right, that are talked about where you don't need a car, but then still buy a car, right? Your bank doesn't necessarily know, and then actually overextend yourself further. The other issue is that, you might want to move into a place where you don't need a car, but the housing cost, because it requires a down payment, is prohibitive to even move into that place in the first place, right? So those places might come with lower transportation costs, but you're not able, because of the initial entry cost, to actually realize that, even if you had the desire to do so.
And then some of those trade-offs are rather perverse because those models suggest that you're paying higher location rents in the center. But if anybody ever traveled south on the DVP at rush hour, you'd see about almost equal amount of traffic going north from the city. So, I mean, that kind of blows the simplistic model out of the water.
Great, so we're getting close to the end of time. We just wanted to give each of our panelists sort of an opportunity for closing remarks. So we'll start with Pamela.
Okay, well, I actually think there's a surprising amount of common ground that we've covered today. I think I would like to just end up with actually something that Russell mentioned at the very beginning, which is where is the work? I think that, we really do need to have some really good tracking and monitoring, for the region as a whole. If we're any piece of policy that's worth putting in place is worth monitoring, and and the opposite is also true. So I really think that the province probably is the one that has to take this on monitoring. They don't monitor the density, they don't monitor how the land is being used, what is the urbanization rate, what is the supply of service lots. Like, these are all important things that should come with these policies around the growth plan. So I think if I were to make a plea for something, it would be that we do the work and we do the analysis, so that we have an informed policy, we can make the planning more effective, reduce the unintended consequences. And in order to do that, we need that analysis.
Great, thank you. Russell, you're up.
I would think I'll just follow from that, which is to say is that, the growth plan hasn't been in place for that long. I mean, it's been 10 years, but it's only really coming in on the ground in a lot of places more recently. I mean, it takes, urban development isn't a quick process. So we don't really know yet what all the consequences are from this. And it's quite clear from the discussion tonight is that, there's no consensus on the degree to which this affects affordability, and we all agree that affordability is really kind of complicated. So, so there's that. So again, it's that kind of caution about jumping into this like next phase of it before we even really understand what's going on exactly now. And I just, you know, that this is a big deal, the way we plan this area and these policies, and we shouldn't go into them blindly.
Okay, Marcus?
Yeah, a couple of points I want to make. One is about the public interest, right? There are the economic impacts, but as planners, we are to consider the public interest, and that means that even if some individuals may have a choice for a particular kind of dwelling with a particular kind of transportation patterns, we have to weigh whether the impact of heavy automobile use in sprawling areas is whether that individual right to do so, you know, outweighs potentially the public costs. And I think the evidence suggests that, you know, there's lots of literature on that sprawls a heavy burden on economic variables like public infrastructure budgets, right, but also on the environment. I also would urge the province, if we're going back to the solution point, I think for me it's Greenbelt plus. Right? We need to have a provincial equivalent of the Greenbelt plan for housing in the GTA and in surrounding areas. It needs to start beyond that, though. It needs to start with a national housing policy that has dedicated funding attached to it. We can talk about housing affordability all we want at the local level. The resources aren't there. We're just going to pass costs from one type of housing user to another. We need to think about it again nationally. That conversation has started, I believe. I'm not yet convinced that it's, you know, going to get where it needs to. David Holshansky, who's been mentioned a number of times today, starts one of his books and one of his reports with a sentence that goes something along the lines, there's no reason that Canada, as the developed country we are, should have housing affordability issues. And then he goes on to explain how at one point we actually came close, you know, to housing people across the country in various income levels, and we dismantled those policies over the last 30 and 40 years. So I would ask us, what housing legacy have we been left now, and what housing legacy are we going to leave our own children and their children? So thank you.
And finally, David, last word.
Oh, thanks. Of course, my bottom line pitch is more economic analysis and understanding of policies before they come on board. And regardless of whether the increase in prices of all the housing is from demand side or supply side, the idea is that if you can provide more supply, it's going to mitigate that price increase. So I think supply is part of a solution, whether you think it's a problem or not. I think it's part of the solution you have to look at. In terms of the new growth plan, the revised growth plan, I think we have to be very careful about this. We see pushback from municipalities. Hamilton already gave some pushback. I think you got to look at the municipalities who might be doing some analysis, see what the impacts are. Hopefully they all are doing that to see what the needs are. Maybe one size doesn't fit all. Maybe you have to have different approaches. And I think there has to be more careful policy implementation and policy development along these lines. Thank you.
Great. Well, I'd like to have everyone join me in thanking our four panelists, Russell, David, Marcus, and Pamela. Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming. I'm going to continue a strong ULI tradition of finishing events on time. Just wanted to give you a heads up. We have lots more events coming up this year. Please check out our website. The Electric Cities dialogue that we started here today with this debate is something we also want to continue, and really starting to get into how do we tackle these really complicated issues like housing affordability. So look for more from us at ULI to try to tackle these really complex issues, because that's really what we're here to do. Thank you all for coming, and have a great night.